Bienvenue à l'IIPE. Welcome to IIEP for this new session of our strategic debate series. And we'll have a very exciting and important one today, and it will be especially relevant for our year-long thematic of dealing with the, looking beyond the obvious to implement SDG 4 and the issue of learning and how to reach that. We know there is a widespread global learning crisis with millions of youth and children unable to perform some basic skills in reading, writing, and math. And also we have a problem of inclusivity. How can we foster all inclusivity in education for a rapidly changing future? And we must look beyond the obvious, and that's the whole purpose of this strategic debate. Nous avons une traduction en français dans la salle, donc je vous invite, le cas échéant, à vous brancher avec ceci. Et we have also an online audience, and after the presentation, the initial discussion, we may welcome questions from the online community, and this question can be asked in at least in English and French, and I gather some additional language may be possible too. Today we have a very prestigious panel, and one that really strikes a chord with me because it's so much linked, and I share that with our director, Susan Grant-Lewis. It's a community of thinking and practice that we are very, we share a lot with them. They are both researchers and practitioners with a very strong experience, and it could have been a four-strong panel with Jipeng Tan, who had to be there and who was my mentor when I started at the World Bank some time ago. But we are maybe in that order of the table. Sajitha Bashir, who is a practice manager in education at the World Bank. And Dr. Sajitha Bashir has over 15 years of operational and research experience with the World Bank, national and state governments, in India and other donor agencies. And within the World Bank, and that's where we met, she has worked in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, where our priorities have been leading policy dialogue, strategy development, and designing and guiding education sector reform programs within the broader framework of fiscal and governance reforms. And this, this macro environment will be dealt with during the session and will be very important. We are also very honored to have, I keep it in the order of the table, so there is no meaning in the order, but Elizabeth Ninan, who's a senior education specialist at the World Bank with 20 years of experience working on issues related to human development in general in several countries, but particularly in Africa. And she has led World Bank projects, studies, and policy dialogue in basic education, secondary education, and skills development in South Africa, Sudan, Rwanda, Uganda, India, and Sri Lanka. And we're also very honored to have with us Marlaine Lockheed, and I saw in the audience many people have met you during, including myself, during their career, and who's now visiting lecturer in the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, and who's come from basically the field of sociology and been an education sociologist with experience advising government, donor agencies, and private organizations on reforms for education quality, gender equity, and school effectiveness. She spent 19 years at the World Bank, where she held various research and senior management positions, including responsibilities for education policy and lending for the 14 countries of the Middle East and Northern Africa. Now, why are we here today? It's because together our produce this face forward in Africa. I see a little label that it's still for presentation only, and the full version is not yet here. So you will probably tell us when we have this available. But this is a basis for today's presentation on overcoming Africa's learning crisis. We all know about SDG 4, but we maybe have some SDG 4 early fatigue on insisting, on the learning agenda and maybe not providing the substance, the diagnosis, the theoretical approaches and practical, guidelines to go forward and to work toward this very important goal. And what our panelists, I think, can bring to us is bringing some complexity, but also a way to deal with this complexity and not dealing with one Africa crisis, but with a categorization of situations. And this is a first step for efficient policies and implementation. So we are in very safe hands here, and you will, I expect, I want no magic bullet, and you won't get any magic bullet, but you will get, I think, a set of recommendations based on a very extensive research and experience. And we'll have a classic format, I would say. I understand, Sajitha, that you will present a little where this is coming from, and the bulk of the presentation will be in the hand of Elizabeth, Ninan, and Marlaine Lockheed. And about 40-45 minutes. Hugues Moussy, our head of research and development here at IIEP, will be the discussant, but it will open after that to you as an audience and to our online community. So thank you very much. We're very proud at UNESCO IIEP to welcome you today on this milestone study. And over to you, Sajitha.
So, thank you very much, Paul, for that warm introduction. And we are very honored to be here to be able to present to this audience. I already heard from a lot of our African colleagues that they had heard about this event. And so I think this is an excellent opportunity for us to present. I'll just take a couple of minutes as the presentation will be handled by Liz and Marlaine. As you know, the World Development Report of last year focused on education. This is the first time that the bank actually decided to have a WDR on education, and it does throw a light on the learning crisis worldwide and has three main recommendations: that it's important to assess learning, it's important to align institutions to get them to focus on education, on learning, and to act on evidence. This work was actually started prior to the WDR. We didn't know, in fact, that the WDR was going to be on education. And the reason why we started is that in the Africa region of the World Bank, there was a recognition that the quality of basic education is suffering and that it's low. Various indicators seem to show that, but we had no real body of evidence or no analytical work which pulled that together. So when we started this work, we were starting without the WDR. We started without much data. And as you will see from the presentation, a lot of comprehensive data sets could be used for this research. So I want to just acknowledge the team. Apart from the three of us, Ji Peng is also the fourth author, but there were a whole host of others who participated in various ways, and it is really a great team effort. We hope that this will contribute to the discussion on how Africa can achieve the SDGs, because and I think we ourselves realized only after completing the work how big the challenge is. And we need to get the message out to everybody. We recognize the huge progress that has been made over the last 25 years, but we also recognize how far behind Africa is in relation to the rest of the world. So we hope that this will help us to help policymakers to prioritize the areas on which we need to focus on. And as Paul said, we distinguish between different groups of within Africa that have increasingly different challenges. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Liz, or to Marlaine to start the presentation. Thank you.
Hard to tell us apart, actually. Okay, thank you very much, Sajitha and Paul, for this nice introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to stand up, I hope, and use the clicker. So why did we do this? I mean, as Sajitha mentioned, and that all the countries in the region have already committed to the SDG 4s, and they are prioritizing basic education, which we define as grades 1 to 9. There's variations in those definitions, but that's what we have chosen here. Our focus is to move from taking stock of what we know. What is the science about actually what produces quality, what enhances access, and move it to how do you implement on the ground that information so that it actually affects teachers and for students on the ground. We also strongly believe that it's important for countries to learn from one another. That it's all very well and good for experts to come in and parachute in and give some recommendations, but it takes a great deal of local adaptation and experimentation and learning from others in similar circumstances. And so we want to sort of encourage what would be known as a culture of continuous improvement. We have a wide audience. We are not humble here. We think ministries of finance as well as education. We think research institutions as well as development partners should also be encouraged to look at this study. What do we learn? Well, we have 3 areas that we'll discuss today. The first compares countries and sort of sets the conditions for why we think these countries differ in many regards. The second is we go into depth in a few main areas. And the third is what are our implications? What's moving forward, what is next? So this is the comparing countries. First off, we wanted to just point out on this slide the extreme volatility of the economy in sub-Saharan Africa. We start in 1960, we go through to 2014. The economy, it rises, there's an oil shock, it drops, there's Jomtien, it rises again, and now it's sort of a bit higher. At the same time, the number of students are gradually increasing over time with a little tick up following Jomtien, a bigger tick up following Dakar. And so the situation in the region has been volatile with respect to the economy, while at the same time, the countries in the region have been doing an excellent job of increasing the number of students who are actually being exposed to schooling. We talk about 4 groups of countries. This first bit here, this is where they were in the year 2000 at their gross enrollment rates. Why do we choose gross enrollment rates? Eventually, it's a sort of an indication of the capacity of the situation to welcome students. It doesn't say how many children of a given age cohort are in school, but it is giving a sense of capacity. And what we see here is that this group 1 country that we call the established group had pretty high gross enrollment rates in the year 2000. These are a bit lower, these are a bit lower, and these are quite a bit lower. But more importantly, we see that in some of these countries, the enrollment rates have, all of these countries generally, the enrollment rates have gone way up over time, so that we have this green bits of dots here that show the current status of the enrollments. And in some of these group 1 countries, the enrollment rates are actually now beginning to gradually drop back to 100%, which is what we would expect if we got rid of high rates of repetition. The group 4 countries are all, but they're still out of school, and that's what this piece of the slide shows. That we have in the group 1 countries, they are established. They're at about 100 rates with very few children out of school. By comparison, the group 4 countries are still working on getting their enrollments up, and then they have a very large share of children who are actually out of school. And then group 2 and 3 countries are in between. You can see the difference in terms of out of school rates between these 2 countries, but they're moving rapidly toward full gross enrollment rates in any case. Now, this is how we see the geographical spread from these countries. Here's the group 1 countries, and they are largely in the southern part of the continent. Group 2 seems to cluster in the central area here. Group 3 is all over the place, as you can see. And group 4 is largely Sahelian. And this is a group of countries that have suffered dramatically from conflict, as we know. At the secondary level, we also have, we can see in the 4 groups of countries, we can see that in the group 1 countries, the secondary levels are quite a bit higher than in the group 4 countries, and groups 2 and 3 are somewhat in between. And they're all progressing. The movement is always upward here for the current, most recent year for which we have data. And our colleagues have worked very, very hard to obtain these data. This is just a figure that we just produced recently to show that conflict is a challenge. Here we have across countries the levels of conflict. It's an indicator that simply indicates how many conflict events per million population in a country. It's a very rough indicator of conflict. It shows that in general, unfortunately, this is the most recent time period, the red line, and the earlier time period for which we have data. And that in a lot of countries, that the amount of conflict has increased over time. In fact, the median conflict level in the region has doubled over this time period. There are countries that have, for which there was more conflict at an earlier period, and such as Sierra Leone, and that's dropped down. But conflict remains a serious problem in the region. Let me turn to the learning assessment data that we actually analyze in this report. Comes from a huge number of assessments at this point. Our first little slide up here shows that virtually every country has participated in some assessment. And these assessments, the ones that we're focusing on, are assessments that provide some comparative information about the performance of children in the system, and also that that have some statistically reliable dimensions to them and can tell about performance levels. So that includes SACMEC and PASEC in these countries. It includes the international studies, the International Math and Science and PISA studies. There are only 3 countries in the region that have actually participated in those, although more are joining the PISA for Development activity. The SDI surveys, which measure 4th grade reading in a number of countries. The early grade readings have been implemented in tons of countries. And this is a measure of adult literacy, which is parallel to something called the adult PIAAC, the adult literacy measure. It's called STEP in the sub-Saharan region. So how are countries doing? Well, there are 96 dots on this slide. And let me talk to you a little bit about these dots. And I'm going to actually refer to my notes here, because this dot shows the share of test takers for each one of these assessments that reached a minimum level of performance. This is not a maximum level. This is a total minimum. So what do we mean by minimum? So at age 15 for the PISA exam, for example, the minimum level in math is solving problems using whole numbers, not fractions, not decimals, not percentages, just whole numbers. For EGRA, at the other end of the age distribution, we have grades 2 and 3. It means if can they read, can they do oral reading, and they reach any score better than 0. Any score better than 0. For the SDI, read a sentence aloud. It doesn't even mean you understand the sentence. It just means you can read it aloud. Some of the other assessments, SACMAC, PASEC, TIMSS, PEARLS, have more complex definitions of minimal competencies, but these are very, very low. So your expectation should be that about at least 75% of the students should be reaching this low level. The bad news is that in many countries, generally in the groups 2 and 3 that have participated in any of these assessments, a high share of children do not reach this. Fewer than 25% of the children actually reach that minimum level of competency in these countries. At the group 1 countries, by comparison, in some of these assessments, more than 75% of the children reach these competencies. So these are countries that have managed everybody in school with low levels of out-of-school children and at least reach a minimum level of performance on these assessments. Now, Burundi stands out. It's kind of an interesting case, which we talk at quite a considerable length in the book. It's one of the few countries where the tests and these assessments were offered in a national language that is the medium of instruction. There are other things that contribute to Burundi, but that is one of the things that contributes to Burundi's success. And we focus quite a bit on language of instruction simply because it makes a difference. In this assessment, which is 4th grade students can read something. Okay, all right. You will note that in Tanzania, the scores for reading a paragraph, this is reading a letter, they all can pretty much read letters, and they all can pretty much read words. But when it comes to reading a sentence or a paragraph, there's some decline in performance in this 4th grade samples. In Tanzania, when the test is in English, the kids are not doing too well in reading a paragraph. When it's in Kiswahili, they do quite well. 80% of the kids can actually read a paragraph. And this is also the case in Togo and Uganda, where yeah, okay, I'm going to go back. And where that level of performance is quite low as compared to Tanzania. Okay. Another point that we make in the book is that we see sources of inequality in performance. Now, this is a complicated slide because it summarizes across a number of studies the effect sizes, that is to say, the units of standard deviation that differentiate between one group and another group of students. So, for example, let's start with gender, okay? Well, this across a whole bunch of surveys, basically SACMEC and PASEC in the sub-Saharan region, we're looking at gender differences in reading and gender differences in math, and these are tiny, tiny average differences. Now, they vary across country, but the average across something like 28 countries that participate in one or the other of those two assessments is a very small percentage of a standard deviation. By comparison, if you talk about SES, it's a very large differentiation. Kids in the highest quintile of a measure of SES outperform by a great deal the students in the bottom quintile of the SES, which is basically an economic measure. I mean, it's items in the home, mother's education, those kinds of indicators. Urban schools also outperform rural schools by quite a bit. And remarkably, if a school language is the same as the home, is a different language than the home language. This is not all these things. The SES of whether or not the school is in a city or a village, and whether or not a child is male or female. The only one that we can actually affect by education policy is school language. So let's show this difference. This is grade 2 scores on mathematics and reading. And these are the standard deviation for PASEC scale score. It has a mean of 500, the standard deviation of 100 points. These are 60 to 100% of the standard deviation. Are quite large in Niger, Togo, Congo, and Senegal. The same story over here. This is for mathematics. So mathematics, you would think, would be a little bit language independent, but it's not. If the kids are taught in their home language, they do much better. And Burundi has a difference, but the difference is very small, and they actually outperform the other countries participating in that assessment. And now I want to turn to what do we know from science about what works, what makes a difference, why do kids learn? And this chart summarizes dozens and dozens and dozens of studies. It's telling you the average effect size of an intervention designed to boost learning. And so if we start at the top, the effect sizes are quite a bit smaller than those gaps that we saw, the urban-rural gap, the SES gap, which was an effect size of a half a standard deviation or a full standard deviation. These effect sizes go up to about a quarter of a standard deviation, which is absolutely normal in education research on interventions that make a difference. I mean, you're not achieving 1 or 2 standard deviations increase in learning of an intervention typically. That would be very unusual. A quarter is pretty good. What we identified. These data were assembled by the 3IE and in a wonderful compendium. You can all go out and read it. It's only 450 pages long. So thank me, we've summarized this for you. All right, structured pedagogy. What does that mean? It seems to work, and as it works in all countries, and it works in sub-Saharan African countries, which are the light green underneath us. It's a package. It's teaching materials. It's teacher training. It's continuous support to teachers. It's teaching teachers how to teach, giving instruction in the subject matter. How do you teach to read? How do you teach kids to do math? So it's a large group of interventions, and it's effective across the board, right? We have extra time. Well, that's no surprise. If kids are in school and they're learning, they're going to learn more, and that is indeed the case, either from a longer school day, more school days in a week, a longer school year, but essentially more time. School feeding, it brings children to school, we know that, and it also seems to enhance their learning occasionally. Teacher hiring is a strange topic. It really teacher corps, so that class sizes become more manageable and therefore children can learn. And what the review calls a multi-level intervention, it just means putting everything together, helping families, helping children, helping schools, helping teachers, the whole kit and caboodle. A lot of things don't work too well. These don't have much of an effect. A lot of very popular things, cash transfers, work really well to get people into school, not so much for learning. And some other areas are surprisingly don't have the evidence behind them. Now, this is based on a relatively few number of studies, particularly for the sub-Saharan region. And so it's important to take that into account. And so the study moves on to talk about 4 areas that we're going to really concentrate on. And these are the 4, oops, excuse me. These are the 4 areas. We're going to talk about student progression, teachers, budgets, and capacity gaps. Student progression, what do we mean by that? What we see is that in the early grades, kids are churning in the first couple of years. They're just repeating. They're coming a few days, they're dropping out, they're going home, they're coming back. So we want to focus on unblocking this early grade traffic jam, that there's some things that have to be done to do that. Another area for basic education, now we're talking about grades 1 to 9, is we need more lower secondary schools, more lower secondary school places for children to go to lower secondary school. And we need to target some people, individuals, children's poor, perhaps in females and particularly for lower secondary school, and rural students who are sort of the last % to be enrolled and move forward. So let's look at this traffic jam. Well, what we see is this, as I mentioned, this churning of kids that just keep repeating grades 1 and 2 endlessly. Very poor learning environments. The class sizes in the early grades are outrageously high, 100, 200 kids with one teacher. And they're all, 6 and 7-year-olds. Imagine being in the room with 100 6 and 7-year-olds, and you can imagine how difficult it would be to teach. We don't have teachers who are prepared to teach reading and literacy and numeracy in that early age, and there's just really few materials in the schools that are appropriately targeted for that age group. And then, of course, we have this language of instruction problem that kids come to school and the teacher is speaking in a language that is unfamiliar to the child. There isn't a lot of reading material in a language that they understand, and they don't master these skills, which means they can't progress. This is an index that we composed, which shows the over-enrollment of children in the first grade. And it is, I prefer to add that. This shows all the countries for whom we have information. And some of them are from the sub-Saharan region. So some of them are above this line, which is the good side. And some of them are below this line, which is the inefficient line, where there's all this churning going on. And what you see is that a good density of countries in the sub-Saharan region are in this range of countries. Now we talk about what is this index. It's just a composite of enrollments, entry rates into grade 1, the gross intake rate in grade 1, the ratio of grade 2 to grade 1, and the pre-primary enrollment rate. It's just sort of, it's a synthetic index to just give a picture of this problem. And so that's what we mean by when we talk about this churning of the kids in that grade level. Well, so what happens? Well, they don't survive through grade 9. Look at these. These are just a range of countries here. In grade 1, Malawi does a great job, gets everybody into grade 1. By grade 9, fewer than 20%, 16% of these kids are surviving to grade 9. Now in Ghana, they're also getting about 100% in, and 90% are surviving. So there's enormous variation across the region in terms of their success in surviving schooling. But as we've seen, you know, the survival rate is one thing and the learning thing is another. So we do argue that it's very important to address both the demand and supply side for getting kids into school. So, you know, we know that from analyses of household surveys that cost of schooling is a detriment to enrollment. We know there are some barriers for girls, and particularly as we move into lower secondary, because as girls mature and they become, quote, marriageable, then they do tend to get married. And so we do think that those things have to be addressed. And so for some populations, they're very vulnerable, and to complete the full cycle special interventions need to just address the fact that there is low demand in these populations. Structurally, there are high-stakes exams that occur across the region at all levels, and these exams do tend to serve as barriers for progression. Now, here we look at the schools that we see in the region, and we're talking about what's the supply side of schooling really look like in this region. And this is about the learning conditions. What are the conditions of these schools? And we have like 6 of these indicators that we talk about that are sort of minimum conditions. These are not fancy conditions. These are not extensive conditions. These are just like the bare basics. Like the pupil-teacher ratio in a class should be less than 50 kids. I still think teaching to 50 first graders would be difficult. Basic services, electricity, toilets in the school. Instructional, we think that teachers should at least have a full secondary education, and there should be materials in the class, and that both teachers and students should attend school, and there should be a conducive school climate. This slide presents what we know about the conditions that are met in the schools that we have evidence from. And this is from both SACMEC and PASEC surveys. The line here shows that they've met at least 5 of the conditions. not all of them, but at least 5. And you can see in countries in groups 4, 3, and 4, a very, very few share of schools meet those conditions. Even the countries in group 2, a very small share meet at least 5 of the conditions. A little bit better in the countries in group 1. But the conditions for learning are rather dire in many of the schools in this region. So how do we have this one here? Okay. We need to acknowledge that in the near future, there will be a vast expansion of lower secondary. This slide shows the enrollment increase due to population growth, the enrollment increase due to trends, the enrollment base year, and that's this line here, which you can barely see, but that's if just you kept the enrollment as it is now, this would be the number of kids that need to be enrolled. So the huge increase in up to the year 2030 in the number of children who will need to be accepted into lower secondary school as we project it here. And so one of the things that we're interested to know is how do you do that? How do you do it? Do you do it with boarding schools? Do you do it with day schools? Which is more cost effective? Which is more affordable? You need to have the secondary schools require libraries. How do you meet those needs for provision to this huge number, doubling number of lower secondary schools? How do you deal with teachers who have the sufficient capability to teach at the lower secondary level? How do you get them to the rural areas? What are the alternatives for providing teachers to this huge increase in numbers of lower secondary schools? And now, to answer that question, I'm going to turn it over to Liz. Here, hold that.
Thanks. So I'm not going to answer the questions. You have to read the book to get the answers. But I mean, all of these points that Marlaine has been raising, we try and address them in the book, and we give examples from different countries in Africa where we've tried to address some of the issues. So some of the issues around the early grade churning and the traffic jam, we bring in the example of South Africa that has addressed the issue. And when we talk about cost effectiveness of lower secondary school, we have examples from around the continent of cost of schooling and how we can reduce the cost of the infrastructure development. So I'm going to talk about teachers. This is the second sort of deep dive area that we looked at in the book, and we have a full chapter on it, but I'm just going to cover a few of the major topics. So with this huge increase in enrollments, there's also been a huge increase in the number of teachers that have been hired in Sub-Saharan Africa for primary education and lower secondary education. And there's going to have to be more teachers that are hired as the system continues to expand. But central to that should be the management of teachers. So are teachers being effectively managed in the countries that we look at? And we look at several household surveys and labor force surveys, and we try and address some of the issues related to what do high-performing countries do that gets good teachers into the system. They recruit the best teachers, they pay them well, they train them well, and they provide a path for continuous professional development. So we look at these various buckets. One of them is around teacher recruitment. And what we see from about 20 labor force and household surveys is that countries in Africa are actually recruiting some of the better educated people from the labor force. And that was surprising to us. You know, we think that we're recruiting not the best educated people into teaching, but actually based on the labor pool that you have, they're actually recruiting good, better educated people from the labor force. Pay is an issue, so primary teachers do get paid less than people in other professions, similar professions. But teacher deployment, I know this is work that IIEP does a lot on. Teacher deployment is a big issue in several of the countries, especially in Group 2 and Group 3. Teacher deployment is not such an issue in smaller countries, so countries like Mauritius, Seychelles, Lesotho, they've managed to deploy teachers where there's greater enrollment. So you have a bigger school, you have more teachers. And that's what the teacher deployment sort of measure looks at. But in countries that are a little bit more mature in Group 1, so that have had full enrollment and for several years, they have a stable enrollment environment, countries like South Africa and Namibia also have good deployment of teachers. But where we see the issue in terms of deployment is where the systems are growing very fast. Education systems are growing very fast, and the decentralized decision-making process doesn't allow for good deployment of teachers. So countries like Uganda, Benin, Zambia have pretty bad deployment of teachers to where they're most needed. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about teacher absenteeism. Marlaine said that, you know, instructional time makes a difference, right? So if you're in class, if teachers need to be in class. So what we see from the Service Delivery Indicator Survey is you'll see the blue bars over here. Is there a clicker? Yeah, the blue bars over here look at absenteeism of teachers from the school. So 15% of teachers in Kenya were absent in the school, right? So if they checked the roster at the school, 15% were absent. Look what it is in Mozambique. 43% of teachers are absent from the school. But what we do see in countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, very small absenteeism rate, is that most of this absenteeism in a lot of these countries is actually authorized leave. So they've actually been given leave either to sick leave or personal days. In Senegal, a large percentage were given leave to collect their salaries. So here we have a management problem, right? They're absent from school, but we could deal with it if the school was managed better, that they would have teachers that can come in and support or otherwise, or get the salaries to teachers in a better way. But if they are in school, this green bar shows whether they're actually in class. So look at this, in Ethiopia, 5% are absent from the school, but of those that are in school, 22% are absent from class. So it's no good that the teachers at school, they need to be in class and they need to be teaching. So this is an issue of accountability, right? Teachers are coming to school, but they're not teaching. And how do we address that issue? 55% of teachers in Mozambique who are in school were not in class. So whatever you do, if we get teachers to school, we need to get them into the class. But once we get teachers into class, it's not sufficient that they're in class. They should know what they're teaching. And they should have a better they should have good understanding of the content, but also have the pedagogical skills to deliver the class. This is also based on SDI survey data, and this is a test that was given to the teachers, grade 4 students. And oops, you'll see over here, Kenyan teachers do a little bit better. This is the percentage of teachers that answered the question correctly on language. So we look at different domains on language. We look at grammar tasks and composition tasks. This is from the SDI survey. And you'll see as you get to things like composition, they're not doing very well on this domain. And when you look at mathematics, simple addition of 2 digits, double-digit addition is not too bad across the countries. But when you go to subtraction, it's getting worse, and it's getting really bad when it comes to comparing fractions. So the content knowledge, we are recruiting, remember, we're recruiting better educated teachers, but content knowledge is weak. So we have to deal with that when we think about pre-service training for teachers. that some of the content knowledge, there needs to be support for teachers on that. So even if you know the content, are you delivering it in a way, are you delivering in a way that the kids understand what's being taught? So do teachers have the pedagogical skills? And we see from the service delivery study, again, pedagogical scores. So these were questions that were asked about how teachers would respond to a situation. And the correct answers across the countries, it's much worse pedagogical skills than content knowledge, right? So you'll see over here, this sort of moves in complexity of the task, right? Preparing a lesson plan, it's actually not that good. You know, the best we have is on Tanzania, 58% answered correctly on preparing a lesson plan, but quite low in other countries. But when you go up in complexity in terms of evaluating pupil progress, there is very, very few of them answered this question correctly. So we have a real issue around content knowledge, pedagogical skills, and that really points to how teachers are being trained both in pre-service and how they're being supported in service in terms of mentoring and coaching and training of teachers. What we tend to see a lot of in the Africa region is these one-shot training programs where you send teachers in for 2 weeks of training and then they come back and they expect to deliver in the class. And what we see in high-performing countries is really more of a mentoring process where training for teachers who are in service is more at the school level, and support is given within the classroom or close to the classroom. So I'm going to move quickly to budget and talk about budget, which is an area that everybody's interested in, especially ministries of finance. And so we look at some of the OECD data on budget. And I mean, basically our conclusion here is that there's just insufficient resources for education in the region. We see public spending as a share of GDP has increased in a lot of countries in the Africa region. So about 6 countries have the share of spending as a percentage of GDP is about over 6% for about 6 countries. And for about 13 countries, it's between 4% and 6%. But there are a large number of countries that have spending as a share of GDP, which is lower than 3%, which we consider very low. Public education spending as a share of total government expenditure has been relatively stable, around 17%. And we see in Group 1 countries, they do show a high commitment to education, and a lot of them spend close to 20% of their overall budgets. Public spending budgets on education. But what we do see is per pupil spending on average is very low. So this is the median government expenditure per pupil annually across these regions. And you'll see Sub-Saharan Africa is $208 per child in primary education, and the next up is $451 in South Asia. And you see that it's also quite low in secondary, lower secondary. Well, this is actually secondary, all of secondary. So per pupil spending is definitely low, but it ranges, right? In South Africa and Mauritius, they spend $2,000 per student. In DRC, on the other extreme, they spend $50 per student. So what kind of education are we actually giving children when they get to school? Household contributions to total education expenditure are high, but as a percentage of a household's total spending, it's actually quite small. But just very quickly on this slide, this is the breakdown of spending by levels of education, primary, secondary, and tertiary. And what was surprising over here was that when you look at the average for Group 4, about quarter of the spending is on tertiary education in Group 4. Remember, Group 4 is the countries that are not doing so well in primary education, but a country like Liberia, where you saw the out-of-school rate of about 70%, is spending quite a bit of its budget on tertiary education. In group 1, we see this large percentage towards secondary education, and I think it really reflects that they're moving towards, they've got most of the kids in primary education, they have relatively stable population growth, and they are focusing on the next level. So it's not good enough to have more finances. The budget needs to be executed properly. So what we looked at was the public expenditure and financing and accountability framework, the PIFA analysis. And we looked at all of the countries based on some of these measures, which looks at planning for the budget and budget execution. So generally, you see that planning is getting better, and a lot of initiatives around it, of which IIP is one of them. Planning is getting better in a lot of countries. The GPE has also spurred countries to come and develop sector plans. But what we do see is that while the planning has got better, the execution is not fantastic. So this is looking at the PIFA data. An A over here is you're doing well. A D, you're not doing so well. This is being in school. So where you see budget executions very, very low is on non-salary expenditure. Salary expenditure is not that good either, just to say, right? So it's getting better, but non-salary expenditure, things like textbooks, teacher training, school construction, these are really very difficult for countries to implement. And a lot of these are donor financed, right? So this is an area where we need to really focus our attention in strengthening public financial management systems within countries. Okay, last focus area, which is on capacity building. And I mentioned earlier that, we have better planning, but what we do see is that, yes, there's a better planning, and we have a little bit more data, and countries' capacities to collect data is improving. But capacity of countries to analyze that data and use it for planning purposes is not very good. And we look at that from looking at the EMIS data across several countries and how it's being utilized. And we see the utilization of data is very low. And that's really important for countries in terms of how they move forward with their education systems. We see that not just in terms of education management information systems, but we also see it with learning assessments. So we have lots of learning assessments that are happening in the region, but are they actually being used? There is where an area for a lot of capacity building that needs to go into that area. Building technical skills within the countries, as Marlaine said earlier, building skills related to curriculum development, teacher training programs, assessment, that's a clear area that needs continuous support. And this is more longer term support that we need to have in this area. And the capacity to coordinate and negotiate. Since there's so many actors in education, there's different levels within a decentralized system, and there's also civil society, teachers' unions, etc. These are all skills that we believe are needed in the long term. So what are the implications for the region? I think we tried to summarize it as we went along. But just to summarize, we need to make learning a serious goal in the region. It cannot be just about access. We need to focus on access, but learning needs to become the center of what we're doing. It's not good enough to get children into schools. We need to make sure that they're learning. And to strengthen literacy and numeracy skills in the early years. And we say that we really need to tackle the issue of the early traffic jam in the group 2 and group 3. We see it in group 2 and group 3 now, but we're probably going to see it in group 4 shortly, right, as they start to increase enrollments in that group. And really focusing on structured pedagogy in early grades, combining curriculum with integrating the curriculum with teacher training, assessments, monitoring, and also using the language of, focusing on having the language of instruction closer to the home language. And ensuring that children stay in school, as Marlaine had talked about earlier. The next thing is, in the region, we do need to continue to focus on access. There's a large number of children that are still out of school, and we have very high fertility rates in a lot of countries in the region. And countries that have done well in getting to group 2 and group 1, they will be continued pressure to expand the system as more children enter as more children are actually born in this case. Strengthening the teacher core, as I had mentioned earlier, focusing on, for the teachers that are in service now, that we focus on giving them continuous support, and that it's closer to the school and in the classroom. And for teachers that are entering into the service, that we revamped the pre-service training so that we can really focus in on curriculum knowledge, teacher practice, but also instill in them that pre-service is not where it ends, that it's the start of a continual professional development process. And lastly, that we need to have more additional resources for the region, yes, but we need to utilize the budgets more effectively and to strengthen capacity. Thank you very much. Sorry for being here.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I think through your presentation we got two benefits at once. We had a masterclass in methodology to how to get together such a comprehensive set of data, how to link different dimensions. So I'm thinking about our training, teaching here about how to do meta-analysis, how to combine the econometrics. I love the part on standard deviation, Marlaine, and deep dives, which is a complementary approach. So that's, and then on the more substantive part, of course, there is a lot to say, but we've not been overwhelmed. There is a wealth of data, but it connects well. So it's not, heavy. It's many levels we can use, and I saw the one that are reachable by policy, because socioeconomic status you probably can't do much on the short term, but there's so much you can do on through this package that make a difference. As the managing repetition, the language issue, there are so many aspects, and probably the message that it's not only planning. And I hope IIEP is about that trend, that it's also implementing, and it's a whole cycle of education reform. And we are very aware of that, but to be reminded that way is perfect. Hugues, you have the easy task, to start the conversation that we'll all have after with the audience here at IIEP Paris and online, thanks to our social media. Hugues.
Thank you, Paul. I thought you would never stop and you would say everything I wanted to say, but it's okay. Thank you. So thank you very much, Sajitha, Marlaine, and Elizabeth for this presentation. Thank you also for this production. I think it's a very important piece of material for everyone who works in education development, every professional for education and development, and also researchers, students, and practitioners. That is very helpful, very also complementary to the World Development Report of 2018, because as you said, I didn't know that, but you began to work on it before you even knew that they would work on education. And at the end, we see that there is a very strong complementarity of all these pieces and all this work. Just a limitation on what I'm going to say. I told you that at the beginning, I only read the overview, not the whole book. So what I'm going to say now is based on that. And so excuse me if there are more, and there is more in the book that in just the overview. Just a few comments here to engage and open the conversation. Of course, as I said, this work, this book that you just released is very important for all development education professionals. And there are three, I think, very, very important points that I would like to highlight. First of all, we have here put together the best available, if not reliable, sometimes it's difficult, data and evidence up to date. We had also received with the 3IE people who wrote this report, and it was an important piece that you used and reused specifically for sub-Saharan African country. We all know and we all support the fact that data and evidence as such are important, and it's very well highlighted in your work. And they are also and more particularly adapted to Africa and low and middle income countries, which is not that simple, because very often of the lack, once again, of data and maybe less of literature than in other parts of the world. I also thought that the conceptual framework from science to service delivery is very important and very well articulated, and helps provide clear avenues for action, policy options, and also helps structure the policy dialogue in countries with partner countries. The other thing which relates to that is that you have a strong diagnosis based on data and evidence. You have this continuum to policy option, but also you focus and you insist on prioritization. What do we want to do? So you have a menu of options, but you insist on the fact that there are some options that seem to work much better in particular context, and they should be prioritized, which is important. And especially in planning, we are kind of always pinpointing the importance of prioritization to really focus on a few reforms that would lever the overall education system and make a difference. The third point, I think, which is very important, is that there is a strong continuum in your production, in your book, between a global knowledge that we can have, but also linking that to local or national action, which is very important. And you have a strong highlight on contextualization. You really open the window for contextualization. Of course, you have a global knowledge, but there is this continuum to going to different policy options that should be adapted to particular contexts. And that's also where it's getting very difficult to know what policy options can be selected, because from RCTs, for example, or a number of overall data, you don't know either you don't really know, and it's pointed out into the 3IE report, really why it worked. And then you need to go into more analysis, or when it works and you know why, you don't know how to import or export what has worked in a particular context. But you say that clearly, I think, and you point out the fact that contextualization is really important. And that's also, I think, it's very important that you have this grouping of different countries, because it's kind of a way to have different stages from global knowledge to going into context and national priorities or even local priorities, and also to open the window for, as you pointed out in the presentation, for a global South dialogue or South-South dialogue. So really reliable, as much as possible, data, very solid evidence, clear pathway to policy options for global and also regional agenda, and open windows on specific country context, which is so important, particularly in education. I would like now to comment on 3 aspects of your work, which are more open questions, both for you and maybe as an appetizer for the discussion we will have. That number of questions that I had when I read the overview. The first one, and nothing will be surprising to you, the first one is that you provide a number of policy options within the different topics that you have, and most of them relate to what can be decided by ministries of education, by educational professionals or the education community, like bringing schools closer to rural children, revisiting curricula, revising curricula, better training or better allocating teachers, strengthening EMIS, and so on. That can be decided by ministries of education on the overall education community. But in the same time, we know, and you pointed that out by the range about the standard deviation, that what is the most important factor in both going to school, access to school, but also in learning is really the socioeconomic status of kids, children. So one of the questions we all have that, of course, is how do we also try to have an influence or an impact on factors which do not depend specifically on the range of action of ministries of education. And I think the World Bank is an institution which is very well equipped to do that, because you are not only specialized in education, but you cover the whole range of development issues and development, I would say, disciplines. So it would be interesting also maybe to have your view on that and see how we can all work to not only do what we can do within the range of a Ministry of Education action, but also how to work with others to influence such things at the socioeconomic status. And not only because it struck me that the most important thing is socioeconomic status, and there is only, I exaggerate, but one policy options among maybe a few dozens, which is cash transfers. It's not the only one. Better allocation of children plays a role too, but cash transfers. And we know there's probably more in interacting with this issue, which is a global issue of poverty, not only education. Then, of course, we all like the what works approach, but and the continuum there is between a strong diagnosis, once again, based on data and evidence and policy options, and then knowing that you need to contextualize these options so it fits into a particular country, so it can work. But the what works approach also raises another question, which is how to make it happen. We have policy options. We know, even if by proxy, that it can work, or it works very often. There are a lot of surprises, actually. We saw that. But how can we make it happen? I will take 2 or 3 examples here, maybe just 2. Building accountability. It's very high on the global agenda. It was high on the WDR report. It's high also in your policy, in the policy options that you present. But as you say, and I quote you, the influence of rent-seeking and patronage in public administration as a whole has also had deleterious effects on the education sector. That's just one sentence, but behind this sentence are so important, I don't even know how to call them, political, cultural aspects. So here, accountability, there are a number of tools to develop accountability within the Ministry of Education, but behind that, what are the levers for change? How do you change things that relates to, when I was a student, we used to call that mentalities. It's I think, very difficult. How do you tackle such an issue, which, of course, intricate political, cultural, social factors, but in the same times, which is very important, because if you don't manage that, it kind of trickles down to a number of more technical things that you cannot really change, such as inequitable allocation of resources that are very much related to that, for example. Second example, the language of instruction. It's very well documented. In some countries, Burundi, I think Tanzania too, there is kind of a vehicular, more or less common language of instruction. It's not the case everywhere. And here again, it's documented there. It is evidence, but it is very political. I take the example of Cameroon, where I had the chance to live for a number of years, 250 languages, most often, except in the northern part of Sahelian part of Cameroon, with a very small geographical coverage. So the language of the colonizer, both French and English, it's a bilingual country within the constitution, is also a way to avoid political tensions. So how do you deal with that, and how do you make it happen? Some people find solutions. I remember a consultant who came to Mozambique and say, why don't you just speak English, by the way? But maybe it's not the right solution here. And there would be other difficult things. Conducive school climate against sexual abuse, violence. It's really embedded in a whole social world, and not only into school. And all the things, hence my last and final remark, which is that the overall approach is a very economical and econometrical, and we learn a lot, and we need this data because we learn a lot of things. It goes beyond opinion, and it goes beyond everybody's interest, because you can have something which is more like objective, even if data are not completely reliable in some cases. And the approach is very useful to elaborate, especially at global level. And I use it global, both global, regional for all Africa, and even global nationally. A strong diagnosis, a base for policy options. But in the same time, I think this kind of approach, and I say that very comfortably because I know there's also a sociologist among you, right? And a senior education specialist, have more shortcomings when we enter the how to make it happen phase. How to make it happen, and it relates to this. My second point is not only based on econometrical measurements, but also on a more interdisciplinary approach, which is needed when it comes to national, local context, and such levers that you need to work on. So how do we all, by all I mean every discipline working on that, work together to have both a global picture that goes against opinion, and that's the strength of data, but also things that are maybe more localized or have other approaches through anthropology, sociology, maybe also a stronger historical background, not only back to the 1990s, but also back to, in some cases, the independence and beyond. And how do we put all that together so that we go into we introduce the more political issues, maybe everybody talks about that, also political economy approaches that helps us understand better when something works, and when we want to make it work, how we can make it work. It was also stated here in this report that we don't always know why it works, and that might be also putting together these different approaches. Of course, it's a question for all of us. It's an old question, I think, not only for educationers, but do we say educationers? I'm not sure, but education practitioners, but also in development. And if we want, as you clearly pave the way for it, to go into the ground, to propose and to make suggestions for clear policy decisions that will be implemented, I think we have to maybe dive into more of these, put these approaches together, dive into more political economic approach, so we don't stay in something that would be theoretical. I don't think that your proposals are theoretical, but they might stay theoretical if we don't find the levers for change behind that. And of course, it's very easy, but we don't want to go in theory, though. I went to support my 16-year-old daughter yesterday for her homework, and when I entered the room, I read on a poster, and maybe this is because we're terrible parents, one day I will go live in theory, because in theory everything's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Without further ado, I think you pretty much can organize yourself in answering this initial round of questions. Thank you.
So you'd like,
and then we'll open.
so maybe I could just take a couple of issues and then let my colleagues also answer. So you did ask Paul when the main book would come out, and that's going to come out in a few weeks. So this is just the overview and a presentation copy of the overview, but the main book is like this thick, and it will answer a lot of your questions also. I think I appreciate very much your comments, and they're very thoughtful. I'm not going to answer all of them, but I want to concentrate on one issue. We really felt that the gap in Africa is the gap between policies and planning and implementation. And the implementation has to be at the school level, right? Finally, that's where children are and where teachers are. That's your service delivery unit. So this is why we took this framework of from science to service delivery. And Liz didn't spend a lot of time on this last part, on the capacity to implement, which is a last chapter, on which we don't have that much data. In fact, the data we have is about lack of data, which is from UNESCO and UIS. But the others, we don't have a lot of data. But you cited one sentence about the political economy and the fact that there's patronage systems. The electoral cycles are based on patronage, which include a lot of issues related to education. Where are schools built? Where are teachers deployed? How are textbooks procured? And so on. These are the sources of rent seeking and of patronage also in many education systems, not just in Africa, but in other education systems as well. And we give examples in the book of things that have worked. So, the colleagues presented mainly the big picture analysis. Actually, our book also has many, many boxes with examples from Africa of things that have worked, why they have worked, and why they have not worked. Also, we couldn't present a lot of that, but this was one of the main objectives of our book, to show good examples from Africa, not just cite Finland and Korea and so on, but things that have worked in Africa and things that have not worked. So, for instance, in this case, we cite examples of textbook procurement and school construction in Uganda and Mozambique and others, where you can see and Malawi teacher deployment, where you can see all these political factors at play. It's not even in the overview in detail. And there is no, general answer to that. You have to be able to adapt to that context. And that is why we say that for the ministries of education, beyond planning and programming and so on, they have to learn the skills to negotiate and to coordinate and to actually implement at scale. Why it is difficult to take for instance, the 3IE examples of good impact evaluations, the problem is when you take it to scale, you're dealing with a whole set of other issues. And we can only say a few things about that. We know that we have to therefore change the way in which we are perhaps preparing projects and implementing them. I'll also mention one other thing about language of instruction. Yes, this is difficult, but I think this is one of the first books that is making this quite an issue in Africa, that we cannot address the learning crisis, especially in early grades, if we are not able to bite the bullet on this. And we give the example of Ethiopia, where there are over 90 languages that are spoken. They provide instruction in over 50 languages. And this is a policy that has been adopted from 1994, where they provide textbooks, teacher training, teachers, etc., in those languages. So it is possible, and all the donors have adopted that policy. They all finance it. Doesn't mean that they have necessarily improved learning, because still the quality of teachers, the quality of teacher training, all those issues are hindering the effective implementation of the language of instruction policy. But it is possible if there is a good policy, it is supported by all the donors and is actually implemented. So we don't think that this is an impossible task. Burundi is the other case, one language, fairly well consistently implemented for quite some time. And that has also succeeded, relatively speaking, obviously. Thanks.
If you want to complement, no? Or we can.
Yeah.
And maybe it's better to.
Yeah.
So thank you for this complimentary. I mean, I get the right instruction now that however clever we go out of this room, we'll still have to read the full book. I suggest that we take 3 questions from the room, and I will add one from the online community and have a round of answers and go like that. So I'm seeing my director, so that probably should spare for her.
I could go last.
I see Richard Sack and and the third one with Miyoko, and I will add one of my own. Sue, do you want to start?
Okay. Very much. We're really delighted to have you here. One query and then two counterpoints. You went quite quickly about household expenditure, and I thought I heard you say it wasn't that high, and but Estelle tweeted that it was high. So I'd like you to just clarify that, because what we're finding in the National Education Accounts that we've been doing is that it's extraordinarily high, much, much higher than government understood in certain African countries. Counterpoint on two of the points. In group 4, you mentioned that for group 4, they're investing more in higher education. And it would be interesting to reflect a bit more deeply on whether or not this is a necessary stage. So I spent 5 years with the Partnership for Higher Education in Africa, a foundation collaborative, arguing against the World Bank conventional wisdom that all we need to do is invest in basic education. And these 7 foundations argued, no. Africa's future rests with its intellectual capital. You have to build it. You can't have a decent education system without higher ed. So perhaps we can understand these poorest of these countries as investing in higher education because it's a necessary piece of building an education system. And then the other issue was the urban-rural. Whether you have any observations, Africa is urbanizing rapidly. And so we see that urban-rural is an important explanatory factor for learning, the location of schools, et cetera. And what might we see? If I suspect we'd look at group 1 and it's far more urbanized than group 4, for example. And so we need to keep an eye on this and think about it. And while it's not fully in the control of education policymakers, it is certainly an important policy issue for governments generally that can provide incentives to support this in a more sane, smarter way. And all the work that's being done on for urban planning throughout the world in the face of climate change, I think it's be a very interesting space to watch for Africa. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. The question, or as Hugues put it quite nicely, is how you go from global knowledge, which the report is largely about, to local action at the local level. And learning, of course, is very much happening at the local level. Families, schools, communities, classrooms, of course. In that context, what local knowledge do you bring into all of this? Local knowledge, what others call other researchers call the vernacular. Local knowledge, which is in the form of master's and local doctoral theses, which is stored, perhaps gathering dust and barely used in local libraries, schools of education and what have you. It's a very difficult topic because it's so fragmented, so atomized, but it has been, the issue has been looked at for quite some time, as a matter of fact. One fellow wrote a book, on, what was it called? Richard McClure, overlooked and undervalued. This is a huge issue, which is generally not addressed or thought about by international organizations. IDEA has made serious attempts at this, and I don't know to what extent you've brought the IDEA literature into your work. Concerning language of instruction, this is clearly absolutely important. And the importance of language of instruction has been empirically demonstrated for well over 50 years, to my personal knowledge. Of course, in the past 50 years, there's even been more empirical information brought to bear, especially in Africa. My reading of the older literature on this, which I had done at one point, did not include Africa. But the issue here is clearly implementation. How do you go from this theoretically but empirically demonstrated knowledge that the local languages count, that is, what the kids bring to school counts is when it comes to learning, at least in the initial years, and the pedagogical efficacy of teaching in the local languages. How do you go from that to actually doing it with all of the political, social resistances, let alone the implementational resistances. I'll stop at that. Thanks. Thanks so very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. This is Miyoko Saito from IIEP. I have a first question is about measurement. I saw the standard deviation that, well, the graph that was showing the size of the standard deviation for each of the countries. It would have been nicer to also show the distribution in terms of the how the percentage proportion of the standard deviation or the variation that is explained by the school within the school versus between schools, in order to give more insights about what might be happening, especially for Seychelles and Mauritius. I know that well, kind of an anecdote, but then some of the things like the extra tuition that is happening in Mauritius, that was making a huge difference even within the school. And Seychelles was the tracking within the school, the streaming that was going on within the school, although that was not recommended within the policy. So that would have been a nice, nicer presentation to see. Another thing is about the language, which, well, language of instruction is what we usually hear, but then we don't hear a lot about the language of the assessment. And so whenever the instruction, the language, the mother tongue or the local language was used for the instruction, the evaluation of that learning also should be done with that language. And therefore, the consequence would be the very complicated model for assessment and for comparison. Even within the school where the people come from different cultural background with different language background, then even the EGRA, PASEC, who have done the measurement at the very early grade, they have been doing that individually, I understand, but then they are using that to compare within the school, between schools. So what would be your opinion on that?
Thank you. I will add one because we have many questions coming from the online audience, which is nice. So there was one actually that was pretty much the same that you just asked about the evaluation and language and fairness of this transnational assessment. And there is one about innovative financing mechanisms. I just read it. How can mechanisms like impact bonds help to bridge the learning gap? How can these impact bonds be made available to the masses rather than just a few individuals? So there is a wide range of questions. So I subcontract to you, Sajitha, and the team.
So then I'll take the balance.
I'm going to start first so I can take the easy ones and then pass the rest on. We had agreed initially that we would present and Sajitha would take all the questions, but it seems to be deferring. Just on the question on household expenditure. So the household contribution to total education expenditure is high, which is what I put up there. But what I said was, when you look at the percentage of how much households spend on education in terms of overall household spending, it seems quite low. It's about, on average, about 7% of overall household spending on education. And again, it differs by country, right? Part of the challenge with the regional report is to come up with averages. But on the higher education issue, and I agree with you, countries do need to invest in higher education, but we were surprised by the proportions. 25% on average of the total expenditure on higher education. And I think the World Bank's been very much focusing around how we can support higher education and perhaps take a regional perspective to that. So we have a regional program on Africa Centers of Excellence where countries can hopefully look at it from a regional perspective. So you don't have to put in all the investment into your country. You can work with other countries and thinking about regional centers of excellence. So yes, we do agree that it is an important area. It was just surprising the levels for group 4. Just on the language of instruction, you know, we've had a lot of discussions internally within the bank, and this question comes up a lot, is that it's just so hard to do politically. And a colleague of ours who's working in northern Nigeria was saying that they're having this discussion about local language, and in the end, they've just decided to go with English, because it's easier. I'm not sure that's the right solution, because it is making a difference, right? And I think there are examples where countries have done this and where they have been opportunities. So, you know, where I was in South Africa in 1994, when it became a democracy, and you know, this was a divided country that said we've got to do local language instruction, and there was a big campaign nationally around which languages are we actually going to decide on, and it came down to 11 languages, and they're implementing it now. There are issues around it, but I think in South Africa it is a special situation, right? There was a political. It was the end of apartheid, right? So there was an opportunity to push the bar. But there are other countries in the world that have also tackled the issue. So it's not easy, but we're saying that we need to do it, and we need to push forward, and we need to find the levers. And I think that's going to be on a country by country basis.
Well, let me take the easy ones for me, which are the methodological ones from Miyoko, largely. First of all, you asked about the share of the variance that can be attributed to schools versus individuals. We actually have a nice little slide that we didn't show, but it's in the book and it's in the annex. And it shows that the major point of the slide is to show that there is a great deal more of the variance in sub-Saharan African countries that is explained by between school differences than within school differences. And we actually do the multi-level regression analyses to try to extract the the topics that explain that in the countries. And indeed, it differs across countries. And that comes back to our first story, which is our recommendation that countries use their own data to do their own analysis to figure out what matters for them. Because what may matter in Ethiopia may be very different from what matters in South Africa, for example. Anyway, so we did that in the book. So there's quite a bit of that in the book. The second methodological question about the language of instruction and the language of the test. In general, the language of the test was the language of instruction. In other words, in all these international comparisons, they specifically adapt the test to the language of instruction. So it's not like students being exposed in the test to a new language they haven't been exposed to with instruction. What? Oh yeah, and if the comparisons are there, if you have, I'm not sure which comparison you mean. What we have is in Burundi, they assess the kids in Kirundi, and in most of the Francophone African countries that teach in French, they assessed in French. You want more? Maybe we should go to.
No,
Yeah.
you have to.
Maybe just I'll take a couple of questions that Richard asked. So on the question of how much local knowledge did we bring in, obviously it would have been very difficult to look at PhD and master thesis, which have been done in Africa. But we did review a lot of literature, you'll see from the references. But what we did, as I said in the boxes, is actually bring in information on specific countries and specific programs that have worked with as much evidence as possible. So in each of the chapters, and in fact, at one stage I wanted my colleagues to put up a slide which showed how many boxes we had of all this local knowledge in each chapter, but we thought it'd be too complicated. So it is there, but I personally think that actually what we have to do is to encourage Africans, students and faculty to engage much more in that. In fact, one of our recommendations is that we need to build some of these technical skills in African institutions, that this over-reliance on international, technical assistance and so on for even this local adaptation.
Supporting educational research in these countries?
Yes. And the language of instruction issue, we've again dealt with it, but you're right, Richard, that maybe the knowledge has been there, and you characterize it as an issue of implementation. I think this is, as Hugues also said, an issue of politics and policy. But this is where donors can play a role. There's a reason why Ethiopia could implement that policy, which you would say is extremely complex, right? 50 languages. Over 90 languages, and then selecting amongst them 50, and then actually delivering. I know, because we're helping to manage that program, that all the donors are aligned on that. But I don't see, frankly speaking, many plans, education sector plans, or even criteria that are set by institutions, including Global Partnership of Education, that language of instruction should be addressed as an issue in the plans. It's an issue that needs to be addressed if you want to address early grade learning. So can we change that conversation and actually help the countries facilitate their taking the right policy decisions? Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have to overcome all the internal consensus building and so on. But this is a case where I think the external factor could help facilitate the taking of appropriate decisions. So perhaps the message is not just for the countries, but also for the partners. I think, was there any other question that we missed? Oh yeah, about innovative financing. We haven't explicitly looked at that, and I'm frankly not sure about how much can be done at the basic education level. I know the general idea of impact bonds is that you kind of help pay for results and so on. I think, there isn't much evidence about whether that works or not. The argument we make is that definitely you will need more resources, and those resources will have to come largely from domestic resources. And domestic revenue mobilization will be fundamental as to whether, sub-Saharan African countries succeed or not. Actually, we have a table in the book which shows the level of aid that is going to basic education per child. I think it's finally, is it $8 or $9, I forget now what the exact number was. That's what is being spent by partners on basic education. It's really low. And of the aid that has gone to basic education, about 40% goes to 5 countries. And it's not even the countries that necessarily are the ones that need the most, like group 4 countries and group 3 countries. There is obviously some of them, but it's not those countries that are getting the most aid. But even if that aid were to increase, it would not be sufficient. Domestic revenue mobilization, you need about 18%, 19% of GDP as tax receipts. And then you need to spend about 20% on education overall, of 20% of the budget. Some countries are near there, many countries are not near there. Will impact bonds help to finance the gap? I think the main argument we're making is that the capacity is so low in African countries. Let's focus on just at least getting the key things to the schools. Let's get some rooms there, you know. So let's focus on how do we build schools everywhere? Where do they need to be built? Let's solve the procurement problems, whatever. Let's do that. Let's get the teachers there. Teachers who are properly trained and who are supported. They're about 95% of your budget currently. Maybe we're suggesting, you know, increasing the amount that goes to non-salary expenditures, but let's get those teachers there, because no learning will take place if there are no teachers. Let's get the books and learning materials there. Let's get assessments done, both in school and, you know, at the national level and so on, so that we know whether kids are learning. So let's just focus on some of these basic things so that you can move along. We think the Group 1 countries, to the extent that they have done things well, have just plodded along and done a few of these things, and that's why they're in a better position, not significantly better perhaps in learning, but they're in a better position to advance. And that is really what we want. We would like the ministries of education to focus on. Not just delivering those simple things requires quite a lot of capacity of different kinds, including negotiations, consensus building, the technical skills, and so on. So we actually say in the book that designing, for instance, you know, accountability frameworks that are complex or incentives that are complex, you know, requires so much capacity to design and to deliver that, and you're not even sure whether they all work, that perhaps that should not be the priority. I mean, don't get me wrong, accountability is important, but what's the best way to get that? We have to deal with very low capacity environments. We have a section in the book that deals with school-based management, and you know, that's kind of all the rage, including in many of our projects. We don't actually find a lot of evidence that that is improving things. And part of the reason is that the capacity at the school level of communities that are not very literate and don't have that much time to spend on managing schools and teachers, I mean, you know, you're going to get, with that level, that kind of capacity, you're going to get only that kind of result. So I think my overall response is that all these new options are good, but there are also certain things that we need to do, which are the basics, and governments should be able to do that. And we have to help in building capacity to just deliver on some of those key things that we know are essential for learning. Thanks.
Thank you, Sajitha. That's on record. And I gather there are not only priorities and last priorities, but also basics and what maybe fancies. We have a sharp limit to our debate because we have courses taking in 7-8 minutes. I see Jim Ackers anxiously looking at me. So if we are self-disciplined, we have time for maybe 2 short questions from the audience and maybe one from the online. So the gentleman on the 3rd row, yes, and on the 3rd and the 4th row, yes.
Hi, my name is Tanaka. I currently work in robotic development. I do project management. So my question is with Lee's presentations in the page around 26. You show about the teacher absenteeisms, and then even they're at school, they may not be in the class. And then from how as I've never been to Africa, this is like actually my first time to expose those kind of programs or educational material. My question were, when there's sort of like a problems you mentioned, like how do they deliver the money? How do they, there's the problems. How I think is there's also a business opportunity on the other hands to solve those issues. And how does the private sector that comes into and say, let me solve these issues, but give some us incentives, and how does those collaboration actually works like today? It's a very broad question, but
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Very short question. If anything could be done from the side of children who are able to go to school and maybe they're not learning that well, but the pervasive notions, even more so in rural areas, that education is not that important and not indirect costs would be too much. They would rather go and herd their cattle instead of going to school, just because they don't think that education will have a substantial impact in their future revenue. They don't see any way out of their community, etc.
Thank you. Well, our very last.
Oh, thank you very much. So I'm a development economics student here in Paris. I'm from Cameroon. And I just have a little question in terms of implementation. Okay, so we've all established that there's a learning crisis in Africa. But I just want to find out, do you face any problems working with these governments in terms, because I get the impression like, oh, we're pretty confident of our education systems, regardless of how we've established that there's some sort of crisis, but going to like an African government and telling them like, listen, you have a problem with your education system. I feel like it's really tricky, especially dealing with like teachers, headmasters, like trying to decentralize the whole process, because it's hard for people to admit like the system is broken. Students are actually not learning in school because everybody is sort of confident in their abilities. So how do you, what is it like implementing these policies to a bunch of people who are confident of what they think they're doing and not looking up to what you think you're doing, basically?
Thank you. That will conclude, except that I will just add to the first two gentlemen question. There was online concern about the rural urban divide, and maybe it can link to these two questions too. So final.
Let me take the last question. I think your question was, is this message accepted? And actually, I have presented now to a lot of forums, and mainly to African audiences, not an audience like this, which includes ministers individually, collectively, whole launch of the National Dialogue in Kenya, African ambassadors in Washington, D.C., the panel at the Pan-African Conference on Education. And I haven't received that kind of reaction. I think the first reaction is they're amazed that we put together this data because they themselves find it so hard to get data. Secondly, they are appreciative and obviously shocked sometimes at the especially the categorization of countries according to access. That literally, hits a raw nerve to find that you're in group 3 or group 4. And then on the learning levels, I think it just shines a light on what probably a lot of them know, but don't have, quantified data on. So I have not had a negative reaction at all. In fact, in Kenya, the presentation has been distributed to all the counties, and the Kenyan government or the counties or whoever, they decided that they would have to focus on a few of the issues, for instance, providing a standard minimum package to all the schools to equalize conditions, and a few other things. I'm not going into the details. So I think this conversation has to be had in multiple fora, not just with governments or just with academics. But and then there's a lot of young people who participated in the online discussions. I think when people see not only the comparative picture within Africa, but the distance with other regions, they're galvanized and they actually want to solve the problem. And finally, I don't want to, leave all of you with a pessimistic kind of picture. If you were to look from the vantage point of 1990, Jom Tien, right, perhaps nobody would have thought that African countries would have even reached this stage. Because remember, just after that, South Africa was still emerging out of apartheid. You had the Rwandan genocide, you had civil war in Ethiopia, you had Mozambique emerging out of civil wars, you had long DRC came out of something and went into another long civil war, Nigeria, etc. There wasn't any expectation that Africa would even reach this level. So I personally am very optimistic that I think there's a basis, as long as we recognize that we have to address some issues, and some are tough choices. You mentioned teachers. Yes, but they should also become partners in this discussion. And they should understand what is going on. And they need support also, because they don't have good conditions, as you see. But it is not acceptable, of course, that you go to school and you don't teach. That's also not acceptable. So the conversation has to be had at multiple levels, because education is a social and political issue, not just a technical issue. Any others?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I know you have your sharp deadline, which is over now, but just quickly on the private providers. I mean, it is a very large growing space in the Africa region. But we have to come down to the facts that, we all believe that basic education should be provided free, and it should be accessible to everybody. So even private providers within the Africa region is what we see is this very diverse range of quality that's being provided. So you're saying that, there might be a failure in the public system, private provision can come in to support it, but we see just the same sort of issues in private schools. Low-cost private schools. And I think this is a big issue that African governments are dealing with now, is trying to regulate the space effectively. So really to try and set the benchmark around what private provision should do, basically access for all children and providing the quality that's needed. Where I do see a big role for the private sector that we see, again, in a lot of countries is around technology development. So something like in Kenya, the M-Pesa system has made it possible to provide salaries to teachers through a mobile system. So that's fantastic, right? So this is a private sector supported initiative, which is really making it easier to deliver services in schools. So I think those are very, very helpful. And just on the question of education is not important. Yeah, I mean, the cost is the big driver, right? When you look at the household surveys, why are kids dropping out of school? Why are they not going? It's the opportunity cost that they see of sending your kids to school. And I think it's a combination of factors, right? There has to be big campaigns around how education is hopefully going to lead to future employment of children, but also just bringing schools closer to where kids are. Part of the large costs are, it's still, especially in secondary schools, kids have to go quite far to get to school. So if that's the case, well, yes, it's probably better to stay at home. So I think it's a combination of supply and demand side constraints that have to be addressed to get kids into school.
Well, it's time to thank our speakers for first they offered today as a very nice and thoughtful presentation, but all the work that is behind this presentation, because I don't see in recent years on Africa this such a report with such a breadth of information and sharp analysis and clear methodology, and out of it having this optimistic view and willing view to go forward. So I suggest that we have a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you to our interpreters. Thank you to all the information service team. And rendezvous in 2 weeks, May 15, for the next strategic debate on artificial intelligence and education. Thank you.